Good evening. My name is Selena Joffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas Center. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're honored and privileged to host Audrey Tang, Taiwan's first digital minister in charge of social innovation. At age 35, Minister Tang was the youngest minister without portfolio in Taiwanese history and was given this role to bridge the gap between the older and younger generations. In the private sector, Minister Tang worked as a consultant with Apple, Oxford University Press, and Social Text. In the social sector, Minister Tang actively contributes to GovZero, a vibrant
Aluna.
Taiwan has a little over 1,000 cases, of which a vast majority were imported rather than domestic, and only 10 deaths. Some of the success is attributed to the creative use of technology, social innovation, and collaboration between civil society and government. There are many lessons other countries can learn from Taiwan's experience, which can serve as an example in new possibilities in deploying civic tech to challenge disinformation, encourage trust in the government, and better organize public behavior. Moderating the program is Marty Goosen, Vice Chairman of the JP Morgan Private Bank. He also serves as the Vice Chairman of the Asia Society Texas Center Board of Directors. Following the program, we'll be taking some viewer questions, so please share your questions via the YouTube comment box. We hope you enjoy the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selena. It's wonderful to be back on an Asia Society webcast. And we are indeed pleased, if not honored, to have Minister Tang or Audrey. I don't know which you prefer, Audrey or Minister Tang?
Audrey is fine. You don't have to call me the Right Honorable. That's a more British thing.
Well, we will not do that. I appreciate that. But anyways, welcome. I realize it's very early for you. You're in Taipei, I presume. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's right. It's 8 a.m. So it's doable.
So,
yeah.
And do you have a busy day ahead of you in Taiwan?
Not really. We're post-COVID-ish for around 10 months now, so life is normal, and the tempo is not that anxious.
Okay, well, I'm very glad you're with us and spending time with us so early in your morning. I appreciate that very much. We have a beautiful evening here in Houston, Texas, and I know we have a lot of very interesting people, interested people who are going to be listening to your comments tonight. We're not going to solely talk about COVID, but one of the reasons that I think we all want to understand, the reasons we understand why Taiwan has been so COVID with the COVID crisis that has decimated so many parts of the world. So let me just, we've done several series, Audrey, on the COVID outbreak and the pandemic for our audience. And I'm just going to recap some of the things I do each time, which is, as you know this, there have been 125 million. Just imagine that, 125 million cases worldwide so far. 2.75 million people have died so far of this disease. And here in the United States, we're now over 30 million cases with 550,000 deaths. And in fact, according to Johns Hopkins, there were 86,000 new cases in the US today. Taiwan, as Selena said, has had 1,012 cases thus far. Maybe that's yesterday's number with just 10 deaths. Now, I was looking at the list of countries on Johns Hopkins today. There are 18 countries with less cases out of 192, by the way. There are only 18 countries with less cases, and all of them are either very small countries in places like the Vatican or very small islands. Taiwan is a country of 24 million people. And to have just 1,000 cases is an extraordinary achievement in any standard whatsoever. And by the way, I know very well we can believe the numbers that are coming out of Taiwan.
Definitely.
Maybe we're not believing the numbers from your largest neighbor across the Taiwan.
Well, but we have complete press freedom, so any attempt to hide the numbers will be, explosive news. So yeah, the numbers are probably correct, and the 1,000 or so are almost all in the quarantine at borders.
Yes, and I understand that completely. Before we get to the COVID crisis and to your and the government's reaction, I'd like to learn a little bit about Audrey Tang, because I think there's a very interesting story around Audrey Tang. I've read a lot about you. You were called a child prodigy. You have an extraordinary IQ. Do you remember the first time you heard the phrase child prodigy? Did that mean anything to you?
No, not particularly. I hear about it a lot, but to me, it's just another hashtag, another label. It doesn't mean much to me. What's quite meaningful to me is when the head of the middle school, when I was 14 years old, told me that I don't have to be her student anymore. I don't have to go to the school anymore because I said I can learn better on the internet. So she just blessed my dropping out. So being a dropout, that's more meaningful to me than prodigies or genius.
So you did indeed drop out at 14 or 15, isn't that correct?
That's right, in the middle school, yeah.
So how did your parents react to that? I mean, generally Chinese families are very dedicated to the full education for all of their children.
Yeah, I know. I think they reacted in two ways. One is that because they yielded to the head of the school because she holds authority. So when your head of school said, you learn better on the internet than in my school, I don't want to, pull you back. My parents listened to that. And also because both of them are alums doing graduate studies on politics and law in the National Zhengzhi University. So they just refer me to their professor. So in a sense, I become kind of honorary alums to them. After I dropped out of the middle school, I attended quite a few classes in their university.
Okay. Well, theoretically, we have a rule in the United States that you're supposed to be educated until you're 16 years old. But I guess under this case, you obviously got ahead of your teachers in school. So probably you could have reversed cases and started getting in front of the class instead of sitting in a chair with all of your classmates. Now,
and that led to the homeschool movement in Taiwan. So what I did was civil disobedience, but right after that, it became totally legal.
That's very interesting. So you started programming, or very adept programming at 10, programming, whatever that means. It means nothing to me in my generation. What did that mean to you, starting to be so computer literate at such a young age?
Yeah, what it means to me is that I get connected to the community of researchers. So whatever I'm interested in, for example, back at the time, I was interested in Swift trust. How come people trust complete strangers on the internet? And yet the same internet could also get people apart, like polarized and hate each other much quicker than face-to-face communications would. There's no single study, a single major at the time in any university that would answer these questions. So entrepreneurship, like actually creating such places, is how I experiment with the ideas that I learned, right? But without the internet, without the computer programming, without the ways to basically play the instrument of the keyboard to create the melodies that determine how people interact, it would not be possible for me to validate anything that I learned from sociology or from social interaction design and so on. So to me, really, it's a musical instrument. It just happens that the notes determine the ways that we interact.
That's amazing. And you started your first company at what age? 15, 16?
15. Yeah, I dropped out to start a software company.
And what did that company actually do? What sort of software did you create?
Yeah, it's the first customer to customer auction site in Taiwan. So something like eBay in 1995, 96, and it's also instant messenger, search engine, and many other things roll into one. It would eventually get a lot of investment from Intel before actually exploding at the height of the .com boom. But at the time, I've already move on to my second startup.
That's fantastic. So one of the things that I read about you was that I don't know whether you were one of the early ones, but this concept of civic hacking, which the word hacking is a scary word to everybody, particularly
I know.
Particularly scary to bankers, right? Because we're worried about people hacking into our system every day at the bank. But tell me, what does civic hacking mean? Were you an early civic hacker, or is this something that existed when you started using that phrase or using that technology?
Sure. Well, the banks are actually embracing the civic hackers through the movement called the Open API. So basically, instead of restricting the customers to only interact through the banks, through face-to-face over-the-counter trading or the fixed websites or apps that the banks design, the banks offer the kind of possibility to fork, or that's the civic hacking parlance, to take to an alternate imagination what the bank has to offer via, for example, automated AI assistants and so on, that's built by third parties who are, in a sense, civic hackers that basically look towards to augment the existing services provided by the bank and provide better alternatives. And the bank either sue them or embrace them into the ecosystem. I think they're increasingly embracing them into the ecosystem. So civic hacking does that, but to the government.
Okay, but civic hacking to you didn't have anything to do with banking. I'm sure of that, right? So I apologize for interjecting that issue on behalf of my firm. But what does civic hacking mean to you in terms of your progression of using technology for the betterment of society?
Sure. So just one example. So last February, when we're rationing out the medical grade mask in Taiwan to the over 6,000 pharmacies, there's a civic hacker in China named Howard Wu who worked with the Google Map to make a map so that everyone with their phone can check the real-time availability of the mask in the pharmacy, so they don't have to queue in vain, right? They can just go to the pharmacy. They still have some in stock. And instead of suing him, we provided real-time open data to him and everyone who want to develop such apps, so that people who queue in line can actually check their phone and see the people queuing before them swiping their national health cards and actually get like 2 or 4 or 6 medical grade masks. And if the stock does not reflect in real time, maybe they call the toll-free number 1922 to remedy the thing. And basically this makes the anxiety level very low, because everybody can see that the mask production are being ramped up from 2 million a day to 20 million a day, that it's being evenly distributed. And if people have suggestions on distribution mechanism, they can do so in an evidence-based way. So more than 100 different civic hacker teams developed tools, for example, chatbots, analysis dashboards, and so on, based on this shared open API of mask availability, massively reducing the chaos that could be the case if people go to like 4 different stores or pharmacies without getting a single mask.
Well, we're going to get to that in a second, but chaos was defined in a lot of other countries, including the United States. So I understand exactly what you're talking about. Let's move on in terms of your own progression. You were appointed minister without portfolio in 2016. You were 35. You were the youngest minister ever in the country of Taiwan. How did that happen? Like,
we invited ourselves in.
A middle school dropout. I mean, it's fantastic.
Yeah, we invited ourselves in. We occupied the parliament for 3 weeks in 2014. And it's a nonviolent demonstration. When the Cross-Strait Service and Trade Agreement with Beijing was being signed into effect in 2014 March, people didn't like the fact that the MPs were on strike. They didn't deliberate that substantially, if at all. And so the people invited themselves in, I guess, during the night. And then we start setting up the live streaming, the real-time like court reporter that shows the real-time text of what's being deliberated by the 20 or so NGOs, each talking about, for example, one NGO talk about whether we want to invite the PRC Beijing components into our then new 4G network. Would that be a Trojan horse? Everybody else is talking about that like 6 years down the line, but we talked about that in 2014. And with 500,000 people on the street, many more online, we co-created this interaction space that I was referring to, and produce a set of 4 demands, not one less, which was then honored by the head of the parliament and signed into effect. So basically the Sunflower Movement is a demonstration, but it's not a protest demonstration. It's a demo showing the people in the public service it's actually possible for millions of people to listen to one another and produce useful, coherent trade service agreement assessments. And so because of that, we were hired then at around the end of that year to the cabinet as reverse mentors, as young people who kind of lead the value direction of the country, and I served as a reverse mentor to a minister at large, Minister Jacqueline Tsai, for a couple of years before, I guess, being promoted from intern to a full minister.
Well, then you became after being a minister at Without Portfolio, a year later,
Mm-hmm.
they made you digital minister. Now, this is a phrase that doesn't mean anything to us here in the United States. Did you create the ministry of the digital ministry, or is this something that
Yes.
has now got an actual body, employees, and structure?
Yeah. So the Digital Ministry Founding Act, which the draft just passed the administration floor yesterday, says that it's a full ministry, about 1,000 people, with at least, I think, around 100 people from the civil society and the external experts and so on. But at the moment, the Digital Minister is a title that says, we have an office, but I'm a minister at large, which means that the full-time employees came from the various different ministries. We have secondments from around 12 different ministries. So each one joins my office without actually reporting to a digital ministry, because that will happen maybe a year from now. But they report to their own ministers, but in a way that's entirely horizontal. So we figure out things, for example, to communicate with the public about the pandemic. We want to make sure that people want to wear a mask, but they do in such a way that does not alienate any person. So we invite participation officers. There's around 100 such people engages the hashtags, right? The people on the network. And the health one, the health participation officer lives with this very cute Shiba Inu dog. And so they make this a very cute dog poster that says, wear a mask to protect your own face against your own unwashed hand, with the dog literally putting the food in its mouth. And it went viral, like completely viral. And people, because it appeals to the rational self-interest rather than say, respect your elderly or respect the frontline workers. This is very much fun and get people into the mood of wearing the mask to protect themselves and so on. So because of that, these communication experts succeeded in doing kind of inter-agency, cross-sectoral communication campaigns that enable the kind of listening at scale as Sunflower without actually occupying the parliament.
Very interesting. Does the digital ministry also kind of horizontally work with for example, the finance ministry, or maybe some of the other ministries?
Yes, pretty much all the people-facing ministries have secondments to my office, but we don't have, for example, the Ministry of Defense yet. So I know nothing about defense matters, but we do have foreign policy, finance, education, communication, culture, you name it.
Very, very interesting. And one of the things that I know when I've read about you, there's this phrase that is attached to you called digital social innovation. And define that for us, because again, we're talking to particularly me, someone of my generation probably doesn't really understand what digital social innovation means. How does that all hold together for you?
Sure. Social innovation simply means it's everyone's business with everyone's help, right? It could be any new inventions that helps the society for the public good with the participation from everybody. Now, the digital part of social innovation talks to things about, say, crowdfunding is a way for people to commit financial resources to an ambitious project. And if a project does not get the funding from the crowd, it knows that it's not a good product market fit and therefore does not develop the project at the first place. But if there is a commitment from the crowd in crowdfunding, then those people who provide the fund will also steer the directions into the co-governance of that particular project. So that's digital social innovation. It also talks about, say, collective intelligence, where people could upvote or downvote to resonate about each other's feelings and ideas and emerging situations. For example, in Taiwan, we have a National Taiwan University sponsored student pet project that's been running for 25 years called the PTT. So it's a little bit like Reddit, but there's no shareholders or advertisers. It's purely civic infrastructure, and it's on PTT. For example, in December 2019, Dr. Li Wenliang's message from Wuhan that there's, and I quote, 7 new SARS cases in the seafood market, and of quote, gets propagated to the PTT, and people very quickly start to upvote and triage and get the kind of legitimacy of the messages out, and within just 24 hours, it enabled us to start health inspections for 5 passengers coming in from Wuhan to Taiwan. But compare that to other social media around the world, maybe they also received the message from Dr. Li Wenliang, but there's just so much noise, so much hate, so much divisiveness. It's like shouting to get heard in a nightclub, and so it did not result in the coordinated civic action as our collective intelligence platform like the PTT did. Of course, The Wuhan people also didn't hear that, but that's another story because of their harmonization infrastructure.
So did I read correctly that PTT does not have a reply button? Is that right? Is that one of the things that's true? I know
it has upvoting buttons, but it has no threaded replies. It's basically just people contributing their expertise without a way to kind of devolve into the kind of adversity field name calling and things like that on the interface. So it's entirely because of interface design. There's upvote and downvote.
That's fantastic. So you just answered my next question, was when did the pandemic first become knowledge to the people in Taiwan? And what you're saying, you're getting information coming out of China in December, I guess, of 2019. Is that correct? And what all of a sudden, so by January, the majority of people who are least connected technology-wise were aware that this was going on inside China. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. And what we did is that we not only started health inspections, but we also just very quickly calculated the numerical model of mask availability and the mask efficacy. So we know around early February that if we can get 3/4 of the population access to medical grade masks and wearing them constantly and washing their hands, then the basic reproduction value of the COVID-19 will be below 1 and will be post-pandemics. And we reached that number around early April in terms of availability and efficacy. And so ever after that, we're more or less post-pandemic. And
so most of the world was struggling because their masks were coming from China. Was that the case in Taiwan as well, or were they manufacturing Taiwan? They were manufacturing medical quality masks in Taiwan, because we had rich people here flying their private planes over to China and bring masks back because we didn't have any manufacturing masks in the United States, certainly not medical quality.
Yeah, it did help that we're, I think, the second largest mask producer in the world. But we also expanded under kind of emergency procurement laws. We nationalized the mask production to make sure that we ramp up the production, even though we had around 2 million a day. Taiwan is a country with 23 million people. So we ramped that up by 10-fold and manufactured around April, I think close to 20 million medical grade masks a day. And after that, in May, when we finally have sufficient medical grade masks for everyone, we also crowdsourced by people's dedications to international humanitarian aid. So anyone can just use their app, say, okay, I have plenty of masks. Now from this point on, the mask ration that I didn't collect for the past couple of weeks, and since the last couple of weeks, I want to dedicate it to international humanitarian aid. So like 8 million or so medical grade masks are dedicated and donated that way. So when did Taiwan institute travel restrictions, and how did those travel restrictions work? Because one of the things I think we're going to talk about a little later is the relationship between China and Taiwan. You all knew very early on that most of the origination of the virus was in fact in China. Was it very early on that you restricted travel between the two? Of course, it wasn't free travel anyways, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's always been challenging to move between China and Taiwan anyways. But how did that work? Sure. So at the beginning, it's about the health inspections, right? But on the day that Wuhan city was locked down in 23rd of January, we restricted travel from the PRC. But that's already after we established the Central Epidemic Command Center. So equally important is that we instituted a quarantine measure so that people, even if they come from the countries that are, not the PRC, they are still required to stay in their own residence if they have their own flat or a quarantine hotel for a couple of weeks. And we make sure that they don't escape the quarantine, but we do not force them to install new apps, enable GPS or wear a handcuff or anything like that. Basically, we use cell phone triangulation. So if their phone goes outside of the 50-meter or so radius, the local health officer, and they get an SMS, that's that. But people are willing to work with the quarantine rules. So we have been very successfully enabling quarantine even before we restrict the travels from other parts of the world. Did you close restaurants? Not at all. Did you close bars? For a month. There was a incident where a person working as a hostess in the hostess bar refused to collaborate with contact tracing, and because of her need to protect the anonymity of her patrons. So it took us 3 weeks to figure out the so-called real contact system, where the patrons to the bars need to get maybe a throwaway SIM card or throwaway email registered, but not their name, so they could be communicated. But if there's no local outbreak in the bar for 4 weeks, the scratch pads are literally shredded, and so their identity will not be revealed to the authorities or to the Central Epidemic Command Center. And once we figured that out, the bars reopened.
Did you close hair salons and barbershops?
No, and
I mean,
the schools remain
open.
open.
You're chuckling, Audrey, but you know why I'm asking these questions, right?
Yeah, and these are very serious questions. I get that, but our schools remained completely open. They did take a couple more weeks to get the PPEs and hand sanitizers in place, but at no point did we close our schools.
And at the time, one of the things you talk a lot about in the various things I've read about you is the concept of trust, and you have something called the 3 Fs. Could you explain to our audience what the 3 Fs are? Because I believe that's about trust.
Yes. Yeah, in particular, it's about trustworthiness. It's about making the government worthy of trust and making sure that the government trusts the citizens, so the citizens may or may not trust back. And the 3 Fs are fast, fair, and fun. I talk a little bit about fast, about the collective intelligence and the PTT, but equally important is the toll-free number 1922 that anyone can call and report anything going wrong on our counter-epidemic efforts. For example, last April, there was a young boy that called saying, your rational mask, I get is pink ones. All the boys on my class have navy blue masks. I don't want to go to school anymore. I don't want to wear pink. I'm a boy. And on the very next day, on the daily 2 p.m. CECC press conference, everybody wore pink. And pink became the most hip color. The CECC commander, Mr. Chen, even said Pink Panther was his childhood hero. So the boy became the most hip boy in the class, for only he has a color, the color of the heroes and the heroes, I guess. So that's the fast response, the response in the here and now. The fairness about mask rationing, about mask dedication, I also touched upon, but it's important to note that the healthcare, universal healthcare in Taiwan covers not just citizens, but also residents, like foreign immigrant workers and so on. So that makes sure that there's no loopholes in our protection net when it comes to PPE protection and so on. And finally, the fun part, the very cute Shiba Inu, of course, is our spoke of the CECC. When we introduce physical distancing, for example, we say with this poster saying, when you're indoor, keep 3 Shibas away from one another. If you're outdoor, keep 2 of those dogs away, or wear a mask. It's not only easy to remember, it also makes sure that it spreads faster than the rumors and disinformation. So people don't say, the mask have 5G antenna in it or whatever, other microchips and other conspiracy theory, because the Shiba Inu, frankly speaking, is more fun.
So one of the things we know is that Asians are very comfortable wearing masks. This is something, having lived in Asia for nearly 30 years, is wearing masks is not something that has any sort of social stigma or any sort of other elements to it. That it's so getting people to wear masks and then to actually source masks is a routine thing. I mean, you would, if you had a sniffle in the morning, you would put on a mask before you went to your ministry office, right? And that's just normal for you. That must have contributed to the success of your own program, for example, this crowdfunding, this crowding around the mass distribution and all that.
Yeah, definitely. I think we all remember the quite traumatic experience of 2003 SARS. When SARS first hit Taiwan, there was a real mask shortage because people were panic buying N95 mask. There was a rumor that said only these are useful against SARS. And the communication was quite chaotic, right? The municipalities, the central government were saying quite different things. And we had to lock down an entire hospital unannounced and so on. So I think what's important is that in 2004, right after SARS 1.0, we institutionalized these memories, including the PPE distribution and stockpiling, including the yearly drills and things like that. So people remember as a society how bad it was in 2003. So we decide not to repeat that again, and not go to lockdown if we could, not declare a state of emergency if we could, by institutionalizing the response and playing the SARS playbook of 2004.
So one of the issues that we still are dealing with in many of most Western countries is this concept of contact tracing. And you haven't necessarily talked specifically about that, but as you know, Western governments are terribly shy about this. It hasn't worked. It hadn't worked at all, as far as I can tell. And so I'm not sure we've abandoned contact tracing, but here in Houston, we set up a government agency to do it. And, frankly, I'm not sure it's proven any value whatsoever. Has that been an element of your success in Taiwan as contact tracing? You talked about it a little bit earlier, but I'd love to.
Yeah, it's core. It's core. Yeah, we contact trace anyone who had a case of COVID. People who have been in contact with that person goes into, as I mentioned, home quarantine or hotel quarantine for 14 days. And without contact tracers, we wouldn't be able to beat the R value, because the mask and so on, they only do so much if there's no like the local transmissions, and we never get to the state of local outbreak because it's been stopped by the contact tracers at the border quarantine at any point of the infection. So I would say it's essential that the mask can lower the R value so the contact tracers have time to work with the potentially infected cases. But without contact tracing, mask alone would probably not protect the places where there's less mask use and so on.
Yeah, and of course, one of the big pushbacks here is the issue of privacy. And, my privacy is more important than social good, I guess, in these circumstances. And that's what we run into in our country. But I guess the Taiwanese are quite comfortable with whatever privacy give up on contact tracing is, they're comfortable with.
But the people who frequent but people who frequent the nightlife did not give up their privacy. That's the whole point of the real contact tracing system. It's a social innovation that refused to buy into this zero-sum trade-off between privacy and the public good. What we're saying is that if you frequent a hostess spa or host spa and leave your contact but not your name, and if that place has for 4 weeks no local outbreaks, and that just gets shredded, at no point did we hand those details to third-party processors or even to the government. So this is a social sector initiated, like collaborative participatory self-surveillance. I think that's the term the academics used to describe this, and people trust that much more because both the nightlife business operator and the customer have a incentive in keeping each other out of trouble. Compare that to the more draconian measures where people are driven underground and therefore do not actually report anything at all. It would be like the prohibition era in the US.
Well, I'm seeing that. I think maybe I know one of the things you talk about is Taoism, which is very important in the East. And there is a phrase that Taoists quote, which is to give no trust is to get no trust. And I think what you're talking about is a fundamental issue of trust, right? And that is whether or not we can trust the government with our information, that they were actually going to shred whatever it is they're shredding. You can actually trust that somebody's going to shred that, and in fact, not use that for some other purpose.
But the scratch pad is only in the nightlife bar, in the business owner. It's never copied to the government. So it's not us that does the shredding. It's the bar operator, which has all the incentive to also not leak the intimate details of their patrons. So it's aligned rather than misaligned. That's
a very interesting program. I'm going to go off course just a little bit here, Audrey. We had an interesting program at the Asia Society Texas Center a couple of years ago with a local, very famous news commentator called Ali Velshi. And he and I talked about the concept of the weaponization of culture and the weaponization of there's a very political hot tone in the United States, as you know, particularly over the last 4 years. One clear reality in many countries around the world is the use of disinformation, if you will, for social and political gains. And what are your thoughts on this concept of weaponization of information, if you will, against someone else?
Yeah, I think the disinformation crisis, or as I like to refer to it, the infodemic, share very similar characteristics as the pandemic. The instinctual response from many governments, lockdown on one side is takedown on the other side. But takedown also takes away the social agency for the kind of PTT-like infrastructure to be grown. And so in Taiwan, we basically have this mantra that we don't go to the takedown. We make sure that people get into the mood of media competence by participating in the fact-finding or just news work, right? Journalistic work as part of the K-12 education, but also, for example, during the election where we had the infodemic situation, actually a little bit like the US election, where there was a rumor last January that says the CIA is always the CIA, made invisible inks so that no matter which candidate you vote for, Dr. Tsai will always get a vote by the magically appearing invisible ink, and your ballot ink will disappear. And there's a kind of sowing discord on the tallying process and putting doubt into the election count itself. And so our solution, very simply put, is that all the three presidential candidates and their parties are invited, and even YouTubers among their population support are invited to the counting process. Because in Taiwan, the vote is always paper ballot when we're voting for people. So the counting, each counter actually gets a piece of paper out and take it to various different angles. So the YouTubers from all the three different parties can get a very good view on it, and they all have their own apps, just like mask rationing app, where they can just count right on the spot. So even people completely distrust the YouTubers of other political parties. They do trust the YouTubers of their particular party. And when their numbers agree, there's really no room for that sort of disinformation to spread. So basically, we counter the infodemic by getting the fact spreading out in a more fun way to more people, having a higher R value, and inoculating this virus of the mind.
Yeah. So one of the challenges we're facing here, and I think in other places, where the digital platforms are actually denying access to people and saying, we don't trust whatever you're saying, whatever it is, whether that's a political, social issue, I don't know, but that would never occur in Taiwan, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, there are like useful things that Facebook and Instagrams of the world could do, but we do not actually have public deliberations on it. We have our own civic infrastructure, like join.gov.tw, where people go to e-petitions, participatory budget, and so on. Is at any given time around 8 million to 10 million people, visitors out of 23 million in Taiwan. So almost a majority of people who prefer going there for the public discourses and so on. Trying to have such discussions on, say, Facebook would be like trying to hold a town hall in a very loud, nightlife bar where people have to shout to get hurt, intoxicating, addictive drinks being served, private bouncers that can, escort anyone out at any given time. It's just not a place that's conductive for civic discussion.
It's interesting. One of the things we know around the world is that there are bad actors in all sorts of places, and I'm sure there are some in Taiwan, but there certainly are some in your neighbor across the Taiwan Strait. One of the things that I've read about the situation in Taiwan is that China actually creates, if you will, a very interesting counterbalance to the things that you're trying to accomplish in Taiwan versus the things that are going on. One of the phrases that is commonly used in Taiwan and China, and I'm very fond of Hong Kong, is this concept of harmonization, which is another word but perhaps for censorship or whatever you want to call it. I mean, I know that's one of the things that's very dear to your heart as well, in terms of avoiding any of those sorts of influences in Taiwan.
Yeah, just as we don't want to go back to 2003 and the SARS lockdown, we don't want to go back to 1970s in the martial law era, right? People still remember the martial law in Taiwan, where the harmonization and the surveillance state and frankly speaking, totalitarian regimes was still around in Taiwan. And because people here remember that, we don't want to go back there. And so, for example, when talking about countering disinformation, anything that involves state censorship is automatically a non-starter. People would just say, do you want to go back to the martial law days? Of course not.
Yes, I understand that. And that's got to be a motivator in some ways to some of the freedom of thought concepts that you're talking about, the freedom of contact tracing, if you will, in a COVID relationship. I mean, once COVID is over, those transactions will probably be less necessary, but they're still out there as something that we'll be able to use in other situations, I assume.
That's right. That's right. So I think the important thing here is that the social sector, the civil society, have access to the infrastructure and actually create the infrastructure about, say, the mask map visualization, which is also used to, for example, visualize air pollutions, air qualities, water qualities, like climate sensing and so on. And when everybody get into the mood of data stewardship, media competence, not just media literacy, then the civil society can keep the government in check. And I think that would then force the government to trust the citizens more. So it's a very beneficial cycle. And it would then tell the government essentially that the citizens can actually resist the disinformation campaigns from the PRC or from other places. So that government does not have an excuse to go into, a top-down, take-down, lockdown, shutdown way of thinking.
That's excellent. So I'm just going to remind our audience that in a few minutes, we're going to start we're going to take questions from you for Audrey. And I think this is a truly unique opportunity for us to get a completely refreshing view on the way in which a country is behaving, not just related to COVID, but related to its overall population. I think COVID may be an example of how this is all used, but it's obviously now, it sounds to me like it's been institutionalized. So we're going to take some questions in a few minutes, Audrey, but I have a few more questions, more futuristic in a way. But the first thing I want to ask is, should every country have a digital minister? Should we have in the United States, or should Germany have a ministry of digital ministry? Excuse me.
I'm like, why not, right? So at the same time that we're setting up the digital ministry, Japan is doing the same with the digital agency of roughly the same level of scope, and also with 100 people coming in from the civil society and academia to help the governance stuff. So I think it's an idea that's definitely being more popular, especially during the COVID. And also important is the idea of a digital ambassador. For example, just a month ago, I worked with the French digital ambassador, Henri Verdier, because they are putting up a counter disinformation portal so that people across the world can compare the various large platforms treatments to their jurisdiction in terms of service and so on to counter disinformation. And so I personally translated that into traditional Chinese, into Mandarin. And so I think this is the kind of resource that people can just have a participatory governance even across jurisdictional boundaries and just co-create the kind of tools through, civic hacking one another, right? To the French government or to the Tokyo metropolitan government. I'm just a civic hacker contributing my expertise in the dashboards, in the tools that they create, but it's also diplomatically useful to compare notes between the democratic polities as well.
Well, I would imagine that the Taiwanese government, because you're one of the world's largest manufacturers of chips, is at the cutting edge of being able to use the technology that your semiconductor manufacturers have just domestically. You don't have to rely on Huawei or anybody else at this stage, right?
That's right.
You're able to self-medicate in this whole technology growth phase. So it must be something very interesting for you to be able to keep up with all that, and they came up with you.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things the Sunflower Movement decided in 2014 is that we're not going to allow the PRC components, which could be de facto state-owned enterprises at any given time, a state capture, right, to our 4G infrastructure. So this clean network, clean path thing initiated by the US in the past couple of years, we've been doing that since 2014 and with much success. And so, yeah, we do have some experience in building such a supply chain that's free from the cybersecurity worries and so on. And we're also here to help. We're happy to help.
So I'm going to get back personal again, because I think you've broken many ceilings, you've broken many stereotypes in the things that you've accomplished. But you're also, as I understand it, the first trans and non-binary member of a ministry in Taiwan. You've spoken before about how government and society benefit from hearing and including more voices and experiences. We're going through these conversations in the United States every single day, as you well know. And you've broken that mold in Taiwan as well. And how has that gone for you personally? And how has that gone in terms of the acceptance across your country?
Yeah, I'm proud to say I never face any discrimination for being a non-binary. I get questions like, how can you be digital and non-binary? Isn't digital always binary? And I'm like, I have 10 digits. I'm decimal.
I hadn't thought about that, right? But that's an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, but I'm decimal, right? I have 10 digits. So digital is not just about binary. Anyway, so the point is that I think the experience, my personal experience of going through 2 puberties and so on, have effect in my mind that I don't consider half of population closer to me and half population farther away from me. I'm part of this Homo sapiens, this human community, which is a very large community, and it can really help to take all the sides more, to empathize more, to make sure that we bring the digital to the people rather than asking half of society to adapt to new shiny digital tools. So it also has a transcultural effect, not just a transgender effect.
Well, it says so much for you. So I guess if we're dealing with the future for a second, Audrey, I'd like to ask you, what's next for Audrey?
Okay, next is probably breakfast because this
I get that. Okay,
8 a.m.
Okay, fine. I got that. Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, in terms of career, I think what's important now is that I'm working with Taiwan, with the Taiwan government, not for the Taiwan government. So I'm kind of this Lagrange point that connects Taiwan on one side and the international social innovator movement on the other side. So I'm digitalminister.tw, that's true, but I'm also board member with Radical Exchange, which is this Vitalik Buterin, founder of Ethereum, idea of revamping the voting system, the funding system, using new insights like quadratic voting and quadratic funding. And they've already tried it out in the Ethereum community to much success. And so I'm participating in that governance. And when this ideas comes to fruition, for example, quadratic voting, we then take that into the Taiwanese presidential hackathon and use that in the democracy. So the point is that with like 7 positions internationally, we were basically treating democracy as a form of technology, just like semiconductor layout and design. People can mix and match different ideas about democracy. So it's not just about 3 bits per person every 4 years, which is called voting, by the way, a very low bit rate engagement, but rather things that could be engaging in the here and now. So what I'm doing now is something bilateral, I guess, with Japan, with France, and so on, but also truly multi-stakeholder in like anywhere in the world, people who want to try some of the Taiwan model out, we're happy to help also.
Is there anybody in the U.S. government that you have connections with or communications with that is interested in the things, all of these things you're talking about are so very interesting. Are there connectivities between our government and yours that would help us bring some of this to us?
Yes, I think the Congress Library, is that the word, had a crowd law initiative in collaboration with the GovLab, which I'm also advisor. And the crowd law for the Congress website showed the V-Taiwan model, the model of the crowdsourced collective intelligence that we just talked about. And I think many congressional members nowadays are interested in trying something like that out, especially in more wicked problems, in the sense that people who do not have clear systemic answers to and try to listen at scale. And we've also worked through the POLIS system, the Math and Democracy Foundation, with many different jurisdictions, including, I think there was one in Bowling Green, Kentucky, that did the same civic assembly, a virtual town hall that gets people to see, even if they identify as a Democrat or Republican or Libertarian, everybody agrees on more art in STEM education, STEAM education, more diverse broadband, universal broadband, if you will, and so on. So there are broad commonalities. It's just not as highlighted by the more antisocial corner of social media.
Very interesting. So, Audrey, we received several very interesting questions. I'm just going to pass these along to you word for word in the order they were received. One of our listeners, Pranav, asks, technology can often denote something related to profit-driven corporations or government control. how can it be communicated that implementation of technology in society can be a good thing?
Yeah, this is great. So I often make the metaphor with fire, especially when talking about something like the AI technologies. Fire is dangerous. It burned entire cities. But the impulse for the state or large corporations to monopolize fire didn't quite work out in the human civilization's history. What really did work is, of course, firefighters and fire hazard prevention measures and standards. But most importantly, people learn to use fire as early as possible, maybe as early as 6 years old. We call them cooking classes and sharing our recipes and so on. So in the same way, if we make the investment into the digital public infrastructure, making sure that all 6 years olds have access to GPU computing, to broadband access, to the laptops if their household cannot afford that, then we make sure that they know how to use the technology to improve their life for the better, like cooking a delicious meal, without overly reliant on any particular surveillance catalyst or surveillance state interest. And in 2016, when I first became digital minister, I worked with the then Minister of Culture, Zhen Leijun, to convince the National Budget Office that something intangible, something that's made out of concrete, like literally concrete stuff, could also be classified as infrastructure in our infrastructure bill. It's quite revolutionary back then, but nowadays people are more willing to consider digital as infrastructure to get people universal broadband, universal access, and also a competence rather than literacy-based education so people can wield the technology from the very early age.
I think that's brilliant, and I think that it may take years for people to understand that, but it should be fast forwarded, because you can't think forward 10 years or 20 years where that won't be the case. And if it isn't, we're just delaying the inevitable. At least I hope that's true. So May asks, what lessons do you think the U.S. can learn from Taiwan, given the differences in our two countries? Can some of your methods work here as well? I'm sure you know the U.S. very well. Maybe you can just break down the 2 things or 3 things that would work here, and maybe a couple of things that you don't think would work here.
Yeah, our universal broadband policy, from what I understand, does have bipartisan support in the U.S. also, just as it's a nonpartisan issue in Taiwan. Everybody take it for granted. But on the federal level, as I understand, the U.S. have not placed it on kind of digital infrastructure priority. Rather, it's something like the ICT, FCC policy. And I think it's a very different view, right? Whether you view it as IT or ICT, which is just about connecting machines, or whether it's about digital, which is ultimately about connecting people and empowering people in the civic infrastructure. I think that the Taiwan position on universal broadband as a precursor or precondition to the digital democracy, I think that's something that is thoroughly bipartisan in the U.S. and could actually use more investment in terms of imagination also. So that's one. And the other one, as I mentioned, the presidential hackathon, where people compete every year to get the 5 leading social innovation ideas. It could be about telemedicine, it could be about teleeducation, it could be about measuring climate change using a Pokemon Go-like game that encourage people to refill their bottles rather than buying plastic ones and get push notifications when there's possible heat damage, right? There could be any of those ideas, but every year we choose 5 such ideas. Our president, Dr. Tsai Ing-wen, give a trophy, which is a micro projector. If you turn it on, it projects the president giving you the trophy, so it's self-describing, promising you that whatever you did the past 3 months will become national policy in the next 12 months. So again, it's like a warp speed acceleration to any new social innovation that's worth the while for the entire country to adopt. Something like that, I think, will also be very useful in the U.S. or in any of the U.S. states.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Very interesting. So Max asks, there appears to be a correlation. This is an interesting question. There appears to be a correlation between levels of inequality, broadly defined, and a country's COVID-19 response. Does Minister Tang have thoughts on this connection, this correlation, or does it really
exist? Definitely. The weakest link defines the pandemic, right? So in Taiwan, why I mentioned the universal healthcare extend even to immigrant workers is because then everybody feels safe in the sense that if you develop COVID-like symptoms, it's actually cheaper to get a mask from a nearby pharmacy, to visit a local clinic, to get the entire diagnosis. It's cheaper to do all that than a drive by RT-PCR test in other countries. And so people will voluntarily work with the public health system, knowing that they will suffer no social or financial repercussions if they get diagnosed with something like COVID. And that is very important. But if you have a healthcare system or a unequal access to information situation where people feel afraid of working with the public health system, the social safety net, then these places become the places where the basic reproduction value of virus is larger than 1 and things spiral out of control. We've seen that in nearby East Asian jurisdictions as well.
But so would you attribute what is perceived to be China's success with COVID, certainly locking it down, ring fencing it in a single province, as a similar sort of success, if you will?
Well, the top-down lockdown model, just like if you censor all speech in name of harmonization, you don't get much disinformation. I'm not saying it's not effective. It's probably effective, but the externalities on the social sector is paramount, right? The trust that's needed for the social sector to grow with each other is gone. The lack of, for example, a journalistic sector and the coverage probably cost like the entire planet, billions of lives like immortalized, because if we do not allow the people in Wuhan or anywhere in the world to learn about what's actually happening, then all the lockdown or whatever is basically doing damage control. But if, like the PTT or like any of our civic infrastructure, Dr. Li Wenliang could warn everybody on the planet in an effective way, then we probably do not have the COVID-19 situation to begin with. It's more about preventative measures rather than damage control. So a top-down style may be effective at damage control, but also decimate, like literally cut by 10%, the likelihood the next emergency will be sensed by the social sector or the journalism sector.
Sam asks, what is the responsibility of government when it comes to combating misinformation and disinformation? I think this is an almost Orwellian question. And I think it's a reasonable one we're asking ourselves. Mm-hmm. What is the responsibility of government when it comes to combating misinformation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are two things. First, I already mentioned universal broadband, digital competence, and many the infrastructure stuff. But also important is that we need to be honest. We need to admit our mistakes very swiftly, apologize, and say we'll fix that by the next Thursday. Because if we don't do that, then there's room for disinformation to grow. And so we work even with professional comedians. So whenever there is a trending disinformation, for example, there was one last April that says the state is confiscating all the tissue papers to make masks. So go out and buy tissue papers. And people did panic buy for a day or two. And then the premier's office wrote this very, very funny poster out with the premier, the head of cabinet, wiggling his bum and saying in very large font, each of us only have a pair of bottoms as a wordplay, because in Mandarin, to stockpile twin sounds the same as bottom twin. And so it's viral. Everybody laugh about it. And there's a table there saying, tissue papers are paper that came from South American material, and the PPEs, the masks, are plastic that came from domestic material. So the people don't confuse the two. Had we, just take down the rumor, it will probably resurface in a different form. But because this comedy thing is hilarious, people who laugh about it do not actually have the same frame of mind of resentment or revenge or discrimination or hate to spread the existing disinformation. So after just a couple of days, the panic buying died down. Yes. So it's called humor over rumor.
We had panic buying for toilet paper here for months, so I'm not really sure how that fits and all that. But anyways, so I got two more very quick questions. JJL asks, what will your role be navigating Taiwan in a post-vaccine world?
Yeah. So in a post-vaccine world, we are still doing video conferences as we are doing now. I think this really put Taiwan on the map, on the radar of even the multilateral organizations. So previously, because of Taiwan's relative non-position in the UN multilateral situations, for example, in the 2017 UN Internet Governance Forum, I couldn't enter the Geneva UN building using a passport. So I stay in Taipei, reducing the carbon emission, and appeared in the form of a robot because the robot doesn't need a passport. But nowadays, of course, we're all doing this 16 by 9 boxes, and there really is no restrictions when it comes to a passport or whatever. So Taiwan will also appear in more multilateral and multi-stakeholder, like the Open Government Partnership, which is a physical summit, of course, but has more and more international collaboration going online. We will make sure that Taiwan is the steady presence there, and just Taiwan can help. That's our slogan. You can check it out, and Taiwan can help. That us.
Okay, wonderful. And so the last question, what's for breakfast?
What's for breakfast? It's carbohydrates, a little bit of lipids, and I think some protein. Okay.
Well, enjoy. You've been very kind to share your time with us this evening, this morning, your time, Audrey. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour. It's gone by so fast. I can't believe it. And all our viewers, we thank you for joining us tonight. It's been a truly, I think, invigorating and insightful conversation. And we certainly appreciate you doing this and spending this time with us here. We've learned a great deal, Audrey, and we thank you so much. For our audience, I want to remind you that the Asia Society Texas Center offers over 150 public programs each year featuring arts, culture, education, business and policy, and of course, current events. Please take some time and learn more about our programming by going to the Asia Society Texas Center website. I think you'll find something there of interest for almost everybody in your family. We want to thank you once again for everybody joining us. Audrey, I want to thank you once again for spending time with us in your morning. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and everybody in Houston, we hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.
Thank you.